Hi everyone,
It's been a while.
but we're back in our main hardcore world where I'm only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor. And as many of you, including myself, might have completely forgotten, we managed to finish the exterior of our main building for our end portal transformation. We also outsmarted and subsequently kidnapped a bunch of idiots using the supreme power of boats. The reason for these previously mentioned kidnappings was that our portal transformation will feature a zoo. And that is the part that we'll be tackling in today's episode. But before jumping straight into the wondrous world of animal cruelty, I realized that during these 6 months of hiatus from this world, I had forgotten that the main building was hovering over the ocean, as I had apparently been too lazy to deal with that earlier. This news, I'm sure, isn't particularly surprising to anyone, but it did mean I had to tend to that first. The reason we had to do this before we could start with the zoo was because I was planning on building it inside of the platform for the main building. I know, I'm a genius. But since I was feeling almost as uninspired as an average poem written by a 16-year-old describing themselves as deep and profound, I decided to just do a solid stone wall, along with a slight lining of sandstone and sea lanterns. However, even this took some effort, as the build was significantly larger than I'd anticipated, so I had to take a detour to grab more stone. And this process was just as fun, engaging and thrilling as shoving a toothpick under your toenail and kicking a wall, as this included quite a few steps. Those being to inflict war crimes upon the ground to gather sand to in turn craft even more explosives. We then needed to use said explosives to power our cobblestone farm. But that wasn't it, because we also needed to smelt all of it into stone, meaning that we had to go and use our wither skeleton farm to grab coal. After all of that hassle, I could finally go back to enjoying the process of building a wall that's somehow even more depressing than the one in Berlin. And after having spent significantly more time than a responsible adult ever would in a game made for literal children, we could finally move on to our animal cruelty center. My idea for this zoo was to have the room be a circle shape, where the pods for our captives would all be facing inwards towards the middle. I realized that explanation was about as easy to understand as basic maths explained by an impatient father, but that is most likely the absolute zenith of my communicative capabilities. But with that monstrous time-lapse out of the way, it's a tiny bit easier to explain my vision. The initial circular wall will be the back wall of each container of animal abuse, and the inner circle will be made out of glass, so that we may observe the miserable idiots that were dumb enough to get outsmarted with a boat. The idea from here was to recreate a habitat to fit each of our prisoners. That way we can inflict additional mental and emotional damage by pulling a Truman Show on them. So the next step of this morally questionable project was therefore to establish which animals were going where, which would help us know roughly how much materials we would need in total for all of the habitats. And after using every last bit of my brain power to calculate everything we needed and grabbing it from our base, I went off for a leisurely pillaging session. My main concern was that since we're only allowed to use wooden tools and leather armor, we can't actually get our hands on some of the foliage, which was less than epic. However, after having used my immaculate computer skills, I was informed that we can still get dead bushes from desert villages, which was very epic. I did have to make a few alterations to each of the biomes, as I'm both handicapped and lazy. One of those changes was that I was intending to use cactus and plant pots, instead of just putting them on the floor. The reason for this is that our camels look like the kind of creature that would possess the same kind of lukewarm IQ as yours truly, and would therefore probably think it's a good idea to repeatedly throw themselves into the cacti. At least that's what I would do if I was a camel. I was also intending on making something a bit different for our polar bears, as just having some ice in some water would be kind of lame. And once we had properly defiled Mother Nature, I could return and place in all of our spoils. And rather unsurprisingly, I ran out of resources whilst building the walls between each enclosure, meaning that I got to enjoy flying back to my base and intensely staring at my super smelter like it's a barista on their first day at the job. After a bit of tinkering with our artificial ecosystems and getting them completely ready to be invaded, I decided to add a bit of sea lanterns to the upper part of our displays in hopes of fixing the issue of it looking repulsive. But even with that, our floor was suffering from the same problem as the upper part of our display, as well as my real-life appearance. I therefore started experimenting with ways of lighting up all of the dark areas. I started off by using trees, which I was made swiftly aware was about as good of an idea as looking for a long-term partner on Tinder, as it looked about as aesthetically pleasing as that one exotic dancer that's understandably on a discount. But I rather quickly came to my senses. And by coming to my senses, I of course mean that I gave up. So I decided to go for strips of sea lanterns connecting the inner and outer sandstone bits. And with that, the zoo was ready to receive its inhabitants. So I flew back to our base once more, where we had stored away all of our Shane Dawson branded fleshlights and started transporting them one by one. As per usual, I decided to attach a lead to a boat with our animals and flew my way to the zoo. Everything actually went pretty smoothly with the exception of our goats. I have absolutely no idea how, but when I arrived at the pod they were going in, one of the goats was just missing. I assumed he heard me compare him to a fleshlight and ran off, but I was significantly too lazy to go grab a substitute, so I settled with just one goat. A little solitary confinement has never hurt anyone, but our days in paradise were numbered, as there were quite a few mobs that were immune to the boat trap. For those mobs, I had to put leads on them directly, and go back to using boats like some kind of poor person. I did enjoy the view of dragging a bunch of horses, donkeys and camels across the ocean, but that was about all the fun there was to be had here, as actually getting them into the damn pod was an absolute nightmare. I had to drag a couple of them at a time, as they were absolutely hellbent on choking themselves out and suffocating in walls. I usually don't shame people for these kinds of things, but there's a certain time and place for this stuff. But even though I had tried my best to prevent them from exercising their primal desires in unconventional ways, a couple still managed to slip through the cracks. And after having spent enough time for your sister's cucumber to turn into a pickle, I had finally gotten all of our animals into their new forever homes. So I celebrated this fact by spending 35 minutes trying to grow mangrove trees. But just like with most things in my life, I decided to give up and move on. Defeated, I put in all of the glass and freed all of the animals from their boat prisons. But since nothing ever goes well in my life, I made the erectile dysfunction-inducing discovery that the glass looked like absolute shit. I had absolutely no idea what to do about it, so I went the lazy route and installed a resource pack to remove the glass borders. And with that crisis averted, all that was left for our zoo was the ceiling. I once again went the lazy route and basically just copied what we had done with our floor, but I decided to spice things up a bit as I replaced the inner part with prismarine bricks, once again showcasing my impressive level of artistic creativity. But with that, our facility dedicated to animal abuse by neglect had been finished. Needless to say, this was a massive relief. However, as I mentioned earlier, this whole build is meant to be a portal transformation. This means that there's a massive glaring issue with it, which is that we don't actually have access to the portal. It's not a very great portal transformation if we don't have a damn portal. So that's something I thought might be a good idea to tend to. The portal in question is located in the very center of the build, meaning that it was currently below a ton of water. This was rather upsetting, not just because draining water in Minecraft is about as fun of a task as comforting your sister after her boyfriend said that he wouldn't love her if she was a worm, but also because this is how I died in my first extreme hardcore world. But due to my absence of self-preservation, I got to work nonetheless. So the plan was simple. I would drain all the water by building a bunch of walls, leaving 5x5 block sections for me to drain with sponges, to then flatten out the floor, to in turn blow a hole to the portal. And it turned out to be just as miserable of an experience as I had anticipated. Not just because I had to repair my pickaxes several times whilst flattening the floor, but also because the game decided to pull some sort of cruel prank on me, as there was an absolutely massive cave full of water. But eventually, I did get to the more satisfying part of this horrendous ordeal, as everyone, including myself, likes explosives. It was then just a matter of cleaning things up a bit. My idea for the decorations for the portal was to have platforms connected with bridges sitting on top of a beachy lake. This might sound a bit weird, but that's mainly because it is. I then lit up the pit where our portal was sitting and decorated it. But that is about all that we have time for in this episode. I did want to get a bit more done in this episode, but my planning skills managed to get the better of me once again. But we did manage to finish up the main chunk of the interior, which is better than nothing. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please leave a like and subscribe if you did, and I'll see you in the next one.